I did see it's 86 degrees or something over there.
Yeah, it's pretty nice today.
So they may be at the beach. What is the current social distancing kind of protocol up where you are right now?
We've got, just hi to any attendees. We've got Paul on. I'm chatting with him, and we're going to wait till noon to start on the button there. Traverse City in northern Michigan is kind of on the forefront of reopening safely. I think, larger groups can gather inside and out with social distancing and masks in place, but most of the businesses are open and whatnot. So it's
good.
Yeah, it's
feeling like normal.
direction.
Yeah.
How about there? I mean, it's
well, Florida, where I am based most of the time, is actually sliding backwards, and it's got.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, it's become an explosion of kind of a second round, which is not good. And in the New York area, I would say New York City is doing pretty well, and I'm out in Long Island and also doing pretty well. So
good to hear. So
I'll go back on mute and let you open your.
That's yeah. All right. Get my windows up here. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I see that. Too many windows going here. We got about 2 minutes until till 2 minutes to noon by my count. So just answer and dismiss. Get my notes here. Okay, so I see that it's noon and we've got a number of attendees. This is Chris Rogers, president of the Economic Club at Traverse City. Welcome to the June 19th Economic Club meeting. Thanks for your attendance. Good afternoon to our speaker, Paul Stebbins, who will join us in a few minutes. The members of the Economic Club at Traverse City, your guests, if you've got any joining, and the attendees joining us from FixUS or any other groups that Paul has brought in here. So appreciate the flexibility in the meeting format. I have a few announcements that for the club, and then we'll get into Paul's presentation. We have our essay contest. The readers are working through the essays a little slower than usual due to the switch up in plans here. So I hope to announce the 2 scholarship winners at the July meeting and perhaps have them join via video. As a update for the remainder of the 2021 schedule, this has been relayed in the message to members. We plan to do the summer meetings being this month, July and August, via webinar. If that changes, we'll give you a sufficient heads up and explain why. The annual dinner, we had President Calderon, former president of Mexico, scheduled. We've postponed that or canceled that and are looking to reschedule for next year due to the uncertainty with the fall coming up. The fall meetings will make a decision on in-person or a mix or the webinar and see what we can do. I miss the traditional format and the meals and seeing everybody in person, so hope we can get back to that as soon as it's safely possible. You should see on the screen the website, and I just wanted to point out the contact page, and you can scroll down. Here's where you can submit feedback or thoughts that you may have, email, phone, and then here we've got the social media links for Facebook and YouTube. So please explore that, check those out, like us on Facebook, share it with anybody that you think might be interested in being a member. That's great. One final item, there's a chat and Q&A feature at the bottom of the, should be at the bottom of your Zoom window or app. I encourage you to use that and submit questions, which I will plan to address with Paul towards the end. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker, Paul Stebbins. He is the founding member of, welcome Paul, I'm going to read through your bio a little bit and then I'll turn off my audio here. He's the founding member of FixUS, an initiative of the Campaign to Fix the Debt, and the Chairman Emeritus of World Fuel Services. From 2002 through 2011, Paul served as the Chairman and CEO of World Fuel Services Corporation, a Fortune 100 company based in Miami, Florida. He currently serves as a Director of World Fuel First Solar, Inc. and Silkroad, founded by cellist Yo-Yo Ma. Since 2012, he has been involved with the Campaign to Fix the Debt and is a founding member of their FixUS initiative. He's also a member of the Council for Foreign Relations. Paul, welcome and thank you for your time today. I'll turn this over and be here if needed. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Chris. And I guess that you'll put down your shared screen so I can use mine, or?
Yeah, I will.
Terrific. Great. There you go.
See if stop share. There we go.
Okay, all good. Well, thank you very much, and greetings to Traverse City, Michigan, and thank you very much for having me. Chris, you're kind to host this, and I'd like to thank Ruth also for your generous letter and helping me get set up here and reaching out to our group. I don't know why most of you aren't at the beach today. I understand it's quite nice up there, and it is a little strange to be living in the world of Zoom, but thank you for making time and for hosting this time. I think all of us would agree we face kind of a singular moment in our country right now, and we could all be forgiven for feeling, considerable amount of unease as to what our future might bring and just what the American experiment might be about. I thought I'd start this by just giving you a little bit of my own personal journey. I'm a business guy. I'm not an academic or a journalist. I'm not a politician. I'm not a writer. I came to this civic mission in kind of a circuitous route. My own background is I was raised mostly in Connecticut and in Texas. So I grew up in the suburban New York area and also in Houston. My background was sort of working gas stations and driving lumber trucks and working underground in a mine, which is how I paid for Georgetown, where I ended up going to college. And during my Georgetown years, I did spend some time working on Capitol Hill, which was my first introduction to how the sausage is made in our great nation's capital. And it was quite an insight. I also took time off from school to work on a congressional campaign. So I had a little bit of an insight into the political side of life. But along that journey, the best advice I ever got was if I was really interested in public policy, I should go off and actually get hired and fired and live a real life and make decisions and be held accountable and fail to succeed. And then with that experience, maybe bring something back to public policy. So my own journey was I applied to business schools and got rejected twice and ended up starting a business, which is the sort of strange American story. But that business was started in New York City by my partner and I, and over a number of years, it evolved into a Fortune 100 company with over 100 offices in some 50 countries. Along that journey, I joined something called the Business Roundtable, which was based in, it was a group of Fortune 100 companies that would meet periodically in Washington, D.C. to discuss a number of policy issues on the future of education, the future of taxation, the future of entitlements. Lots of different issues were raised in that group. And we would periodically come to Washington to talk about this with various members of the government, whether they be cabinet members or members of the Congress or the White House. And one of the things that I got introduced to there was the national debt. When I was at the Business Roundtable, a guy named Dave Cote, who was then the chairman and CEO of Honeywell, had been appointed to President Obama's Commission on Fiscal Responsibility, which was co-chaired by Alan Simpson, a retired Republican senator from Wyoming, and Erskine Bowles, who was a retired chief of staff from the Clinton White House. And the two of them chaired this commission, and Dave represented the business community on that commission. And Dave briefed our group at great length about what this challenge was. And we realized that the future trajectory of the fiscal well-being in the United States was in serious trouble. But perhaps more importantly, the business community was pretty much absent. We were not at all involved in that process. And so for me, it was kind of a bit of a revelation that here was this very difficult, long-term, complex issue, and we were not actually actively engaged. We would sort of fly in on the planes, we'd get our briefings, and then we'd go back to our very busy lives. But we weren't really leading anything when it came to fiscal responsibility. Well, anyway, as I got involved with that, I kind of lived through the period, and this is now a bit of ancient history, but where then President Obama and then Speaker of the House John Boehner were trying to work on what was then called the grand bargain to solve our long-term fiscal problems. And the idea was to bring down the level of spending by reforming our entitlement programs, not to eliminate them, but to make them more stable for the long term so that we would protect the most vulnerable in our society. And it was also a commitment to do major tax reform, not just cut taxes, but to actually reform the entire code so that it was more responsibly designed, more progressive, more equitable, and actually drove competitive, attractive capital to the United States. That was the strategy. But it fell apart. None of it worked. It was a complete disaster. And I watched very close and personally while the political system just hijacked all of the normal sort of common sense impulses to want to solve a problem that most of us in our communities exercise every single day in our businesses. We exercise it in our PTAs, our school systems, our school boards, our city councils. We solve problems. But in this case, it was clear that it was more valuable to use these political issues to attack the other side than it was to actually solve a problem. And that was a pretty sobering realization for me, just as a pragmatic business person with no particular ideological dog in the hunt. My real interest was in solving the problem. But anyway, so that prompted me actually to quit my job. I went to my board and told them that I'd been doing this since I was 25 years old. And I really wanted to take some time out. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do, but I knew that I would never get to do anything different if I continued to be a CEO of a Fortune 100 company, sort of living 250 days a year on an airplane. And so I quit. And 6 months later, I met somebody named Maya McGinnis, who ran something called the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. And that was the group that had done all the staffing work for the fiscal analysis that the Simpson-Bowles group had used. And I ended up becoming a proxy speaker for Erskine. Erskine had done most of the work on the road, talking to communities around the country about the importance of the national debt, that this was a cancer that had sort of eaten at the fabric of our society, that the generation of the boomer generation was going going to explode the demands on the entitlement programs, and that our tax code was highly inefficient, and that we gave huge amounts back in the form of exemptions, which we would euphemistically know as loopholes, and that we had sort of a broken system, and we had a duty of care as a society to think more intentionally about those issues. So I went out around the country as a citizen, as a retired business guy, to try to make the case for the national debt. And that's where this story of FixUS really begins. As I went around the country, and this was conference rooms in, Brownsville, Texas, and Walla Walla, Washington, and Colorado, and San Diego, and Galena, Illinois, and lots of different parts of the country, I heard a lot of very interesting feedback from my fellow citizens, which was basically, how could we know as much as we do about this very complex fiscal problem, and yet we can't seem to do anything about it? So what is wrong with our political class that we can actually have this information and we don't seem to have the common sense to want to respond? Well, that seemed to me a bit of a deeper question, and that leads to what was really broken, what was actually going on in our system that had held the system hostage. So I realized that maybe we were talking about the wrong issue. While the debt was very important and the fiscal issue was important, maybe there was a more insidious, more foundational problem going on in the American experiment that had a lot more to do with our political structure. It had to do with our economic issues that were deep in sort of the inequality, the sense of not being able to get ahead, the shrinking middle class, the urban-rural divide seemed to be a much more deep issue than just something about the debt. We had cultural issues. There's huge demographic change as people were moving around the country. Community was changing. The nature of how we related as citizens was changing. Our relationship to traditional things that would bind us as a fabric, whether it was Rotary clubs or Lions clubs or religious institutions or churches, the things that used to bind our community seemed to be more fragile than they had been. And so we also lived in a media age, which was very quick to demonize the opposition. It didn't particularly promote or celebrate sort of civil discourse. In fact, it heightened the tone of debate, and I began to get an insight that the media model, the media revenue model, was all about actually creating the fight and was less about creating common ground. So people become increasingly distrustful of media. And I heard a lot of complaint about that from people saying, why am I being asked to sort of participate in a false narrative that's making me pick a side in a fight that I don't even understand? And we found also that there was a disconnect even from our nation's leaders. The business people had been busy working on globalization and the great promise of a global economy. But while we did that, we weren't paying a lot of attention to what the impact might be on the future of work, on people who might be left behind in the society, people who perhaps were not ignored as we went and celebrated our new globalism. Perhaps we weren't paying enough attention to what was going on in communities right here in our backyard. There were many, many, many issues that were going on. So as a business guy, I came back to our team at committee and said, geez, maybe we're not talking about the right thing. Maybe this is actually a deeper issue. So that led us to begin to explore what's actually broken in the system. What is happening in our country that might merit? Well, as a business guy, your first impulse is to think sort of as an engineering. It must be an engineering problem. So if the problem in Congress is that we've got extremist ideologues on both sides of the partisan divide that seem more intent on squabbling than they do on actually solving a problem, maybe we should look at the structure of how those people get elected. And that leads you on a journey to things like gerrymandering of political districts. And you find out that in our country, there are only 12 competitive districts left because they've all been carved up to favor one side or the other. So there are very few competitive districts left. And most of that districting process is controlled by a political process. It's controlled by state legislatures. It's not controlled by independent bodies for the most part. It's not controlled by judges for the most part. There are a few exceptions. But by and large, you have a system that was being increasingly carved up to create political advantage for one side or the other. And of course, that doesn't help the polarization problem. Even more insidious was the primary system. We found that the primary system was broken, that very low percentages of turnout would be showing up in our political primaries, and these would tend to be the true believers. So you've got 5, 6, maybe 7% of eligible voters. typically the most passionate and most ideologically motivated, were showing up and began to have an enormously disproportionate influence over the selection process, both at the caucus level and at a primary level. And so you began to see a phenomenon where the highly ideological candidates on both sides were being elected in primaries. Moderates were being left out of, were typically losing in those highly ideological primaries, and they were being fed into a gerrymandered system. So that created a pipeline, a feed of very highly ideological folks into a body, a deliberative body that's designed by its very foundation to be deliberative and to be focused on compromise, was now ideologically more focused on making points, scoring points, and telling a big narrative story about an ideological thing, and less focused on problem solving, which creates, of course, a very negative feedback system, because citizens began to see a Congress that was increasingly dysfunctional and was not working. So there were structural issues, but beyond the structural issues, we found out that that was only part of the story. The other story that was even more profound was what's going on inside our value system as a country. What does it mean to be an American? What is our American story? Do we even have a shared narrative anymore? Is there something that binds us or not? And if so, what is that story? Is it a set of value system? Is it our founding documents? But in the ideological warfare, particularly under the context of a cultural warfare, those narratives are being increasingly hijacked to service ideological ends. So what we discovered was that there was a sense out there that there was a huge middle ground of people that I was meeting in conference rooms around the country that were basically telling me, I feel politically homeless. I don't identify with either one of the ideological extremes. I find the constant barrage, just the inundation of information from the cable news channels to be disheartening, and it's highly polarizing, and I don't recognize it in my own life. I don't hate my neighbor. The popular narrative that we're so polarized and so tribal that we can no longer have a conversation with people in our own community. I don't believe that, because I see it in my own community that that's not true. So why are they telling me to pick up a gun and be part of one of these fights on either side? I don't like that. And what I found also is that beyond just being politically homeless, people were tired. They were just exhausted. They were absolutely exhausted by the constant, incessant, terrible vitriol that had begun to characterize our political discourse. So that meant people shut down. They basically disengaged, and they wondered how on earth did the greatest political experiment in history get reduced to this. And of course, there's some history on this. If you go back even to the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10, where in Madison's great words, he says, different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good. Well, that was written in 1787 by James Madison, and they warned us against parties. At that same time in our history, if you go back to George Washington, it's very interesting, his farewell address when he left office basically warned the country that there were 4 things that would take this very fragile experiment in self-government and destroy it. The first was hyperpartisanship. The second was foreign intervention in our domestic affairs. The third was fiscal irresponsibility. And the fourth thing he warned about is the absence of civic education to tell our story, to distinguish why this experiment was unique in the history of civilizations, that we did not have the royalty or the class hierarchy of Europe. This was a country under Alexis de Tocqueville where the individual could make good, anybody could get ahead. But that experiment has basically fallen victim to his 4 things he warned against: hyperpartisanship, foreign intervention in our domestic affairs, all of the hacking in our political system. And I know as a business person, it extends far beyond our political system, but the very invasive, insidious attacks on through the internet and through cyberspace on our country are profound. Fiscal irresponsibility. I think anybody who's read a newspaper knows that we're spending an enormous amount of money, which is urgently needed at this time of great crisis, but it does put future generations at risk, and we have to be thoughtful about that. And then, of course, if we're not teaching the story of our country, and we don't teach what separation of powers even means, and we don't teach what those founding principles mean, it's no wonder that we've got entire generations that are coming up in the system for whom the system doesn't work. They don't know what that system means. So I think we have a deeper, more profound problem. I thought as a business person, it was sort of a journey of humility, because as a business person, and a successful one at that, I'm the American story. So in my view, I had grown up in a country that had rule of law, that had a robust public education system that would give me talent to build my business, that I had a political system that I knew was fundamentally sound. I mean, there were examples of corruption, but by and large, I could believe in it. I knew that the judicial system would protect me, that, you know, I could be protected under contract law, that it wasn't like having everything that I built being stolen by China. Here in the United States, I could build a business and be free to compete, that there were antitrust laws that protected me. There were lots of things that the American experiment gave to me that allowed me as an American citizen to build an enterprise that was highly competitive in the world. And we built a tremendous thing. But I thought, my gosh, if we're dismantling all of the things that that made that possible, what then is the future of our country? And it certainly doesn't mean the future of our the past of our country was perfect, by no means. I mean, we've got lots to answer for, and anybody who's been even remotely awake in the last couple of weeks knows how profound and how threatening and how deeply troubling the systemic racism in our country really still is. And we have a lot to answer for. We have a lot to think about and learn about in terms of eradicating that once and for all. We all have a duty of care, and we all own it, and none of us get a pass. Well, that was certainly true of the business community. So as a corporate guy, how could I possibly get a free pass on tax policy or entitlement policy if we pretend to lead, but we're not leading? Or if I am, you know, the kind of CEO that says, geez, you know, I'm a genius and I made this great company, and none of these things are really relevant to my business. It's all about shareholder return. And none of the great things that made America possible had anything to do with my success. And by the way, I've got my ranch in New Zealand, so if things get bad, I can always go there. That is a deeply troubling trend, because it begins to erode the fabric of our civil society and the things that we all share as common purpose. And it creates enemies. We now have people that are saying, look, I'm out for myself, and I no longer care about the larger good. Well, meanwhile, as I was watching all this, we began to realize that these political issues in terms of structural reform, the economic inequality and lack of mobility, the urban-rural divide, the coastal elitism, you know, the Los Angeles, New York mentality sort of against the middle of the country, the sense that people were feeling politically homeless. We also found that deeper than the structural issues were sort of moral and ethical issues. There's a wonderful writer that I would highly recommend to anybody in this call named Jonathan Haidt, and he's a social scientist at NYU. He teaches at the Stern School of Business, but he wrote a very interesting book several years back called The Righteous Mind. And he talked about, why do good people disagree on politics and religion? And it was the first time that I began to understand that the things that I was seeing around the country when I went to talk about the debt, but I was getting this expression of great frustration and alienation about our political system, was actually captured very well by John Haidt, who said, look, in the absence of a trust or a faith in the institutions that used to protect us as Americans and used to, you know, ensure our well-being as a common narrative, we have built a tribal system that now people say, look, if the uniting idea, the e pluribus unum, the thing that creates our oneness as a nation, if our common story is being lost, where we've begun to demonize and fracture into tribal entities, if the institutions fail, you really have nowhere else to go but to your tribe. And then you add social media, which becomes a massive accelerant of this pronounced phenomena. Everybody says, geez, if the institutions that are supposed to protect all of us, if Wall Street blows up the world with derivatives and mortgage debt and all that, and we get the great financial crisis of 2008, and we blow up the world and nobody goes to jail, well, gosh, it's hard to have a lot of faith in the business or the financial community. If government continues to be inflexibly locked into this partisan warfare, and we can't seem to have goodwill and compromise on either side, whereas the great majority of Americans would like Democrats and Republicans to work together, and we see nothing but political warfare, well, the institution of government is not working. If we see the kinds of events we've seen more recently, It's hard to have a lot of confidence that our policing system is working well, that we have good community relations, that racism is not still a deep and profound issue. So we begin to lose faith in our justice system, in our policing system, and all the other institutions. If we begin to see the politicization of the courts, even at the highest level of our country, people lose confidence in the institutions of justice all the way up the ladder to the Supreme Court. You know, if we watch the media basically have a revenue model that pits us against each other, well, it's no wonder that it's hard to know what truth is anymore. What is truth in a world where anybody can say anything? So if nothing is true, then everything is true. And that creates cynicism and alienation and a sense of disrespect for all these things. So we all retreat to our tribes and we check out of the system. So voter turnout drops, people disengage, confidence in government fails, and we have a terrible system on our hands. So that was the journey that I found, and that led to the beginning of what was FixUS. And one of the most interesting things we learned about, and I'm going to actually enter some screen share here to help you describe what I'm talking about. There was a particular group that I learned, you know, that as I was looking at this sort of 78% of Americans that believe the Republicans and Democrats should work together. But we live in a democracy that people, you know, we've got millennials and Gen Z that don't even know what a democracy is because we don't teach it in our school system. But what I found was there was a group called More in Common. And More in Common was a research group that was based in Europe, but also had an office in the United States. And they put out an extraordinary report in October of 18 called The Hidden Tribes. And what that did was, instead of looking at the political spectrum in the traditional ways that most of us, or at least many of us on this call, grew up, where it was either Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, or right, left, whatever. These were the kinds of nomenclature that we used to think about, you know, growing up. But what this group basically said is those are very blunt instruments. It's very difficult to understand the complexity of political ideation among citizens in this country through these traditional ranges. Because what we found from Pew, the Pew studies told us that more and more, about 63% of Americans, regardless of their political registration, regardless of their political affiliation by party, were self-identifying as unaffiliated, because the parties had been increasingly hijacked by ideological and very illiberal extremes that were beginning to drive the narrative in both those parties, which meant it began to squeeze out increasingly a middle of people that might still be registered with a party, but it's not the party that they registered with originally, and it's not a party that they recognize today. So the first thing they identified was that these old traditional nomenclature no longer work. If you look at the word liberal and conservative, these also have lost much of their meaning in the traditional classical sense, because in the classical context of liberalism meant individualism. It was Edmund Burke out of Europe. It was John Stuart Mill. It was the idea of Frederick Douglass. It was Alexis de Tocqueville. That's what conservative was, but all of a sudden conservatism had become this sort of culture war where you were either in the camp or you were out of the camp. And the more that it becomes a culture war, the less you become to identify politically through the transactional nature of using the political process to solve disagreement in common cause. And it becomes the increasing effort to demonize the enemy. So if you don't agree with me, it's not a question of us having different views of how to solve a problem. The issue becomes, if you disagree with me, you must be my enemy. And so that narrative has begun to hijack the political system. So the More in Common guys, so this Hidden Tribes, they gave this spectrum here, which you'll see on the screen. On the far left is the extreme of the progressive activists, who make up about 8% of the country. And on the far right, you see 6%, which is what they call the devoted conservatives. And in between, you have a broad spectrum of traditional liberals, passive liberals, politically disengaged, traditional conservatives. And in that middle zone is what they began to identify as the exhausted majority. Because what's ironic was that the activists on both sides control most of the money in the political system, and they control the loudest megaphones, because it's only through passion that people get agitated to get involved in the system. And then you add to it the social media, where the Facebooks and the Instagrams and all these things begin huge accelerators of their algorithms, and they reward the extremes. because they give you a platform to take a small, tiny minority of activists and turn into a hugely loud, displacing noise. And that's what social media has become. So it's a place where you can be publicly shamed. Anybody on this call who's ever been the victim of sort of a Twitter storm attack, you can say one thing on Twitter and all of a sudden there are 20,000 people that call you evil, that you're terrible, that they troll you. Now, some of that is from our friends in Russia, and some of it's from our friends in China. Some of it is from politically well-financed groups that don't ever use their name. And then some of them are individuals. But the reality is you end up with hyper intense, passionate extremes that control the dialogue. They have an increasingly illiberal impulse. They're not pluralistic. They're not curious. They don't have shared values. They're not interested in compromise. They're not interested in problem solving. They're interested in creating chaos and warfare between the political groups. But everybody else in the middle is just trying to do their job. They want their kids to have a good future. They want an education system that works. They want a justice system that's fair. They want a political system that's not broken. They want a sense of community and shared narrative. Everybody has an individual story and they want to be part of a larger story that was good. And yes, we've got things to answer for in our history, but in general, the idea of freedom and liberty and individualism and community were very powerful ideas, and the American experiment was unique in history. And here we are busy ripping it apart. And so the extremes are not interested in that. One narrative is that we were an evil, terrible, oppressive system from the very beginning, and that it never had legitimacy. And you have others on another extreme that said the only thing that was legitimate was some founding vision, and that there's no such thing as adding to it over time. I think most of us in the middle of this chart would say, I don't care where you are, more or less on the political spectrum, that you don't buy into those extremes, that most of us would be somewhere in the middle, that the American experiment is worth preserving, that it's something that we value, that it's all that we've all done well by it. And most of us wake up every day and turn on the news and we're exhausted by it. We're sick of the screaming and yelling and demonization. And we would like to have a sense of community. Most of us live those values in our community. Most of us don't have ideological warfare with the person in the cubicle next door to us at work. We don't have ideological fights about who makes the coffee in the morning. We don't have ideological fights with our suppliers and our customers and our colleagues. We don't have ideological fights with our spouses. We don't, argue every single day about some ideological thing in our marriages. We compromise every single day. We compromise with our teenage kids to clean their room, for God's sake. And yet when most citizens look at their normal lives, which is to compromise, have reasonable discourse, to solve problems in service of a larger community goal, whether it's in our school systems or our communities or our towns, whether it's Traverse City or somewhere else in this country, we look at this national debacle and we wonder what the hell on earth happened. So then ultimately, if you believe in that journey, which I do, you find yourself thinking about, if I'm somewhere in there, where do I fit on this chart? And this gives you a little bit of an insight into some of the places that that these researchers found that most of us identify somewhere on this chart. What is our age? What's our religious affiliation? Are we more predisposed to compromise or not? Are we happy? Are we unhappy? Are we distrustful? Are we insecure? Are we cynical? Are we middle class? Are we rich? Are we poor? It gives a much richer texture around the value systems with which we all engage as citizens in our community. So the blunt instrument of the left, right, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal type nomenclature no longer adequately describes who we are as citizens. And most of us resent being categorized. We don't want to be put in a box. We don't want to be told that we're just a pawn in service of somebody's political agenda. We resent that. We identify as Americans first, we're citizens first, and they don't have the right to hijack my individual political disposition. So we end up in a situation where you find there are these deep problems. I recently had occasion to spend some time with Admiral Mike Mullen, who is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in one of the breaks, he was talking about the sort of threats to our nation. And I asked him, what would he perceive to be the most serious threats to the well-being of the nation long-term? And his comment was, it would be four things. It was K through 12 education, the national debt, energy independence. And by that, he meant climate, fresh soil, fresh water in the world, because we'd have more mass migration of people out of drought areas, hundreds of millions of people. And that would cause a tremendous strategic threat on things like food chain and viability of the planet, and then ultimately political dysfunction. But one of the things that he also said was that it's not actually dysfunctional. When you look at the way our political system is, it is set up to respond to incentives. And right now, every single political person, we send them to DC to do our bidding, and we wonder why they don't do what we want. Interestingly enough, all of them are pretty well intentioned. They're just responding to the incentives. It's not broken. It's actually behaving the way the incentives work. And that has a lot to do with money. It has to do with ideology, and it has to do with extremism, and it has a lot less to do with solving problems. So what do we do to solve this long term? I think that ultimately the consequences of all this is that we'll continue to have paralysis in Washington. We'll have instability and uncertainty. We'll be very vulnerable to foreign influence. And I've spent some time recently on some briefings about what's happening on with Huawei and Facebook and the cyber world. It is really frightening what's happening in the cyberspace in terms of its threat to us long term. You'll have rising public discord and unrest because people don't believe in the institutions, and we'll just have growing disenchantment with government. So there are these root causes, which we won't go through again, but basically at the end of the day, we ended up saying, well, why don't we see if we could take an opportunity to understand the root causes. Let's understand these political, economic, cultural, media, technology, elite issues that were causing the deeper trends in our broken system. And then why don't we go out and begin to talk to communities and rebuild the agency back into citizens in this country and give them control back into their own political system. And that's what started the FixUS movement, because basically it's sort of like Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln said in 1862, it's not can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? Do each of us have some agency in our individual lives that allow us to help the change? Because oftentimes you could be forgiven for saying, look, I can barely get through my daily job. Right now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic crisis. We've got 40 million people that have applied for unemployment. We've got an economic system that's leaving a lot of people behind. Globalization did not deliver on its promise. We've got a political system that seems just in a constant state of warfare. We've got deep systemic racism, which is ripping at the moral character of our nation. And so how am I supposed to feed my kids, have a job, get through the day, and then now I'm supposed to, as an individual citizen, figure out how do we negotiate peace in Afghanistan? How do we deal with the threat of China? How are we supposed to deal with the invasion, with Russia, with Europe paying their bills on defense, with all the other deep and profound problems we face as a country, fiscal instability, the future of education? How am I supposed to fix all that? I'm just living my life here. I don't have the tools to do that. That's what you people are supposed to be doing. We're supposed to send you to Washington to fix these things on our behalf. And now I think that you've got a situation where the system doesn't work. It's not responsive. And a lot of us are exhausted and tired. So FixUS is what is how we develop that. And I'm going to put up one other slide here. Bear with me, Chris, and I will add to it here one other screen share, which I think will be helpful to folks. Let's see here if I can find it. Whoops. Sorry, I seem to have misplaced my thing, so I'll just go back to where I was. All right, sorry. Let's not do that. Let's cancel. Sorry, guys, due to technical difficulties. We'll stop that share. So FixUS was born in an effort to try to solve this problem by giving more agency to citizens around this country. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. In the Wizard of Oz, there's the Tin Man, the Lion, the Scarecrow, Dorothy, and they're all going to find the Wizard of Oz. And they get there and they find out that the Wizard of Oz is just a guy behind a curtain, and he cannot give you the brain, he can't give you the heart, he can't give you the courage to change anything. And Dorothy was wearing the ruby slippers all along. If you want to go home, click your heels. And right now we're all waiting. A lot of us are waiting for some Wizard of Oz. Is it Donald Trump? Is it Nancy Pelosi? Is it Mitch McConnell? Is it Barack Obama? Is it somebody out there who's going to sort of make it all go away and get better? And I think at our point, we came to the view that the only way Washington's ever going to fix Washington is not in Washington. It's going to be fixed out here in communities all over this country by the people who are exhausted, who are tired of the dysfunction, who would like to demand better. They would like more civil discourse in their communities. They would like a richer sense of community that they experience in their own lives to extend more broadly out there to the governing system. And they would like to have some agency in how that takes place. So we began to build FixUS as a way to say, look, there are root causes that got us here. It was a long, difficult journey, and it was not good. It was a bad, difficult journey, and we should think very intentionally now about how we use that information. Just going to just a second here. Sorry. Again, technical difficulty. So we want to be in a position where with FixUS, the idea was, why don't we build a coalition that can do this? So when FixUS was born, we realized that there was this pathology of problems, and we needed to take a longer term view. There are all these issues that we face, a range of challenges, and everybody on this call will recognize that you haven't seen an answer to any of these issues. Social Security is still broken. It's going to be bankrupt soon. Cybersecurity is a threat. Inequality is a threat. Education is bad. Trade policy is in an uproar. Tax policy has still not been sorted out. We've got a lot of issues that are broken and won't get fixed. So we hit the road. We went out to meet people all over this country. We got the feedback that we did, and we began to build out now the state organizations. And we realized, as I talked about, that people were exhausted. The issues are long time in the making. They were here a long time before the current administration. They'll be here for a long time after this administration. And that's the political reality. These are not easy, quick fixes. I went to Georgetown. I'm kind of a miscellaneous Congregationalist out of Connecticut, but I went to Georgetown, and the Jesuits are very interesting to me. They used to talk about how there's no such thing as cheap clarity. If it fits on a bumper sticker, it's probably not true. So if you think that there's an easy, quick fix to all this stuff, there's no way. And so, of course, what happens is all of us want to sort of say, well, if we just fix the term limits, if we just fix the gerrymandering, if we just fix the open primary system, if we just fixed fair voting and it wasn't hijacked by both extremes, if we just got rid of money in politics, there are lots of things that are very seductive in terms of their instant fix. But these issues are much more profound, and we all own them. All of us, every single one of us in our lives own this, about thinking more intentionally about what is our shared common character, what are we all doing to teach the story of America, to protect and defend the story of America, to make it something that lives on for future generations and doesn't just get lost and turn into a complete tribal warfare, which would be bad. So what is this group about? It's about Americans united in a shared concern. It's that simple, that we all share a sense that we all own a piece of how it got here. We would all like to own a piece of how it gets fixed. We would like to exercise more agency in our political self-determination than we feel the parties allow us. And you have to build a movement of community first. And once you have that community and we begin to understand our root causes and we take some ownership for being part of those root causes, we can begin to solve the division and distrust. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is true. There was a very interesting experiment that was done recently in Dallas, Texas. It was run by a guy out of Stanford University named Larry Diamond and a researcher named Jim Fishkin. They took people from across the political spectrum, and I mean hardcore MAGA on one side and deep-rooted woke progressive activists on the other, and stuck them in a room for a week and had them discuss issues. And boy, when these people first walked into that room, it was warfare and enemy. The other side was the enemy. They were not to be talked to or trusted. And what was very interesting is over a series of days, as people began to get into the issues, and people became less objects of ideology, but became human beings that had stories, that had families, that had kids, that grew up in parts of this country, that had shared common things. It was remarkable how much these people actually have in common, despite their very extreme political views. And there ended up being about 68 convergence of agreement on the issues that were discussed. And these were hard issues, things like immigration, things like fiscal issues, things like, anyway, go down the list. Now, there's not agreement on everything, but it did demonstrate that when people actually had time to get out of the false narrative that is projected by the media, that there are these sort of edifices, these objective edifices of enemies, and got into the real problem solving, Americans are quite capable of solving problems, and we still have that within us. So we have set up this idea of building national chapters. We are trying to build a movement of ideas in service of this national idea. People often tell us, is it a third party? What is it? Is it a movement? That is a little premature. It's not about building a political party per se. It's about building a belief system first. And I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, in between. What I want all of us as citizens, regardless of our tribal affiliations, is to bring back some sense of protocol that civil discourse matters. We would like people to sign our pledge of civility. We would like them to sign up and affirm these values that we hold dear, that these are the truths we hold self-evident in our society, that we'd like to see a more functioning government. And that becomes a message that then gets the attention of the political system. Because none of these things will get fixed by one election or one easy magic wand by Harry Potter. They're deep and profound cultural issues. And, I worked, as Chris mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of Silkroad, which was founded by Yo-Yo Ma. Yo-Yo's a cellist, but he's a very interesting humanitarian. And he said once, it's very interesting if you think about the currency of power is politics. Or the currency of politics is power. The currency of our economy is money. But the currency of culture is trust. And we've lost that. We've lost that capacity to see each other, to trust our institutions. And until we can restore some sense of common ground and restored sense of shared narrative and trust, then it will be very hard to fix our broken country. So that is what FixUS was started to. These are the ways that you can sign up. I am so glad that I left my job. I've met so many people around this country that have restored my faith. Hubert Humphrey once said years ago, the guy who ran, in fact, he's from Minnesota once upon a time, but he said that Washington is 26 square miles surrounded by reality. And I think he's right. I've spent the last 7 years of my life wandering all over reality. And this is an amazing country. People don't hate each other. They don't all hate their neighbors. They're not all ideological firebrands who want to burn the country to the ground on the left or the right. They're not all Antifa or white militants, or it's not what makes up most of this country. Most of us are citizens who are saying, my God, I am exhausted and tired and I want my country back. So FixUS is an effort to recruit your interest, your passion, your community work. And you don't have to go run for Senate or raise $100 million to do that. You can do it in your community today. We can demand better of ourselves as citizens, and we can demand better of our public officials. And with that, Chris, I probably ought to take a break here and open it up to some questions and see whether people have some comments or thoughts or feedback. We certainly don't have the answers. We come to this with a great deal of humility. If we knew all the answers, we'd be sitting on some island in the Caribbean, but we don't. It's hard, it's difficult, and anybody who says it's easy is wrong. So, as Alfred North Whitehead used to say, seek simplicity, but distrust it. So we distrust simple answers. We have a lot of humility. We think that certainty and ideological certitude is the enemy of deliberation and problem solving. And we think most citizens understand that and they want to solve problems. So thank you very much for having me here. And I would be more than welcome to answer any questions or take comments.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I'm back on and you can hear me at least, if not the others. Great comments. That was the last 48 minutes flew by, and it's a compelling organization. It sounds like it creates a forum and facilitates a great amount of discussion that could move us in a good direction. So I've got a few questions from various attendees. I'm going to just read them.
Sure.
And so let me go with that. So here's one from a Econ Club member. In your inquiries, has family breakdown surfaced as a root cause? Are intact families still a common belief that holds us together?
A great question. Thank you very much. In fact, it is absolutely one of the things, two competing ideas. One is that, the idea of what family is and means has changed dramatically. Certainly we don't live in sort of the 1950s, Donna Reed, Ozzie and Harriet, perfect nuclear family world anymore, but the values that bind family, the idea of community, well-being, nurturing, love, the idea of creating opportunity, the generosity and the well-being of family. That is something that is a very powerful shared dynamic. And we have seen that in communities of a vast spectrum of political and demographic and regional areas. It's a very enduring primal instinct. People would like to see the values of family held dear. It's the same way that some of the sense of issues around faith and belief and trust. These were the things that used to bind our communities. But we live in an increasingly secular society, but it's also families have become more fragmented and torn apart. We live in an age of, divorce and difficulty and unwed teens and things like that. But it's not from the point of view that we saw a view that there has to be a kind of family, but the values that underscore family and community and trust and well-being are absolutely evident. And there's no doubt about it. There is a longing to get back to that by many, many, many people in the country. So thank you for that question. It's absolutely true.
Yeah. This is kind of a housekeeping question, but if these slides or other similar slides, do you have a slide deck that you can share?
100%. Absolutely. We would be able to, Rachel Heisler, who's on this call, will be able to share slides with not only your group, but to any website that you want. We would be more than happy, the fixusnow.org. If you go on there, you'll see our launch in January. You'll see all the participants. You'll see our library of readings. You'll see the work that we've done on research to build out the root causes analysis. You'll see there's lots going on with this organization. But So
okay, great. Yeah, I had perused that yesterday as well. So there's quite a bit there, and I did see PDF and PowerPoint slides.
Yes.
Mechanically, I see this is kind of far-reaching or aiming in that direction. Is it, are you traveling state to state? Are there a number of people that take this on and speak about the similar principles and approaches and bring people together?
Yeah, there's the current state and then the aspirational state. The current state is that I am one of a number of what I would call sort of proxies or believers who are out talking to communities around the country about this. We've been to over 30 states, and that's growing. And we've got state chapters now in 12 locations. That is expanding. We are ultimately in the process of developing what would be kind of a training program, so that people who are interested in the FixUS ideas, principles, value systems, the civility pledge would be in a position to actually host in their own communities, whether it's through a book club or a PTA or a local Rotary club or whatever it might be. We would give the toolkit necessary and required to allow you to facilitate those discussions in your own community, to begin to build these bridges across divides and begin to see people in your communities as not just the other, but as one of us. And so that's what FixUS is about. But yes, those tools are being developed and available, and they're expanding every day that we go by.
Excellent. All right, a couple more here. How do you see the U.S. debt increase? How does it affect the future of the nation? If we talked about my little kids before the start, for the next generation and those to come, where could we go if we don't act or, address some of these issues that we're trying to address?
So it's a great, thank you very much for the question, because it does bring us back to this reality. There's a little bit, what comes to mind immediately is, some of you may know, there's a great poet, Mary Oliver, but she wrote a poem called The Summer Day. And in that poem, she says, "I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention." And right now, when you think about the enormity of our fiscal thing, I'm not sure a prayer is going to solve our fiscal thing, but we better start paying attention. And so I would say that whether I'm a business guy like Paul Stebbins or wherever you are in your life, the nation needs to at least begin to pay attention. So there's a little bit of history on this. If you go back to the 1970s, about 70% of the budget was discretionary. It meant we were a very rich nation. We had a lot more money than was actually obligated, and we had the opportunity and the choice to spend it on a number of things that spoke to the long-term well-being of your children. So it was education, science and technology, research and development, all sorts of social programs on education. There are many, many things that we could decide as a society to spend on. Right now, what's happened because of the debt is we have continued to eat away more and more and more of the discretionary budget. So right now, today's budget is more or less, in rough numbers, about 70% tied by law to automatic escalation. So that's the healthcare entitlements programs, Medicare, Social Security, all that continues to grow because we're in the boomer generation. And when it used to be sort of 5 people paying in for 1 person having Social Security, now you're getting closer and closer to a 2-to-1 pay in. You've got a fiscal, and it's going to be structurally insolvent by 2033, and we haven't addressed that. You need to reform these. And when Erskine Bowles was doing his thing, he said, look, if you change the eligibility age of Social Security by 1 year, and you started that 50 years from now, you'd fund Social Security for another 100 years. So, but you can't even have a conversation about it because it's so politicized, because there are old people living in Florida and they get postcards saying those evil people are going to take away Social Security. It's a terrible thing. So the fiscal thing is absolutely going to hurt us long term. In the current circumstances, what's most troubling is that we should have been in a much stronger fiscal position going into the crisis than we were. And by that I mean, if you go back to the history of this country, and there's a great book, Bill White, who was the former mayor of Houston, was actually a fiscal scholar. He wrote a book called America's Fiscal Constitution, Triumph and Failure. And what he chronicles is that going back to the very beginning of the country, every single time we ran a large deficit and we ended up with some debt, afterwards, both parties, bipartisan, always paid down the debt. And that even after World War II, where our debt was 108% of GDP, Truman paid down the debt. Eisenhower paid down the debt. After guns and butter with Johnson, we paid down the debt. The only time that we got off the rails is in the early 2000s, we began to have the new drug bill that was unfunded. So we passed a law, but we didn't pay for it. Then we started fighting wars overseas, which are very expensive. And then you had the boomer generation all coming of age. So you had more people demanding more of the entitlements. So you had an unvirtuous cycle where we had reduced revenues and we had increased the spending side without any long-term plan for how we were going to solve that. Then you add to it the wild card, which is interest rates. And right now we're in the lowest interest rate environment in history, and we probably will be for some time. But I think there are people on this call, being an economics club, you're going to agree that it's not inconceivable that we might go back to some kind of higher interest rate sometime in the future. And every time you move the interest rate 1 percentage point, you're adding trillions to our cost, right? Because that's how big the number is now. We're now at 25 trillion in national debt, and that's growing. So we're well on our way to 80% of debt to GDP, and we're going to be over 100% of debt to GDP very soon, given the massive amounts of infusion. So I would argue it was sort of ironic that, as you know, historically, at least in the partisan context, the Republicans were always sort of thought to be the fiscally conservative, but 55% of the current deficit last year was legislated in the last couple of years. And I don't mean that as an attack at Republicans. What I mean is that both sides do it. There is nobody innocent. Everybody has participated in the deficit spending. And this isn't some magic panacea where you're going to see a balanced budget. That's not going to happen. Nobody ever expected balanced. Even Jack Kemp, famous conservative, said balanced budgets don't work. You got to have the flexibility to use debt when you need it, the same way a company uses debt when it needs it. You just don't want to be leveraged 300 to 1, or as a corporation, you're going to go under, or like the banks in the financial crisis, if you're leveraged 40 to 1, like Lehman Brothers, you're going to go bankrupt. Well, the country's going to go bankrupt as well. Now you say, well, you can't go bankrupt. You're a country. We own the assets of the Tetons and the Adirondacks. How could we ever go bankrupt? All I'm suggesting is that fiscal responsibility is something that we all own, and it's going to have to be there. Right now, we are in extraordinary circumstances where we are trying to respond to an enormous crisis. But when we make our way through that, fiscal reality is going to hit us hard, and we better be ready for it. So yeah, we've got to pay attention.
Paul, thank you. I think I'm going to have to wrap it up on that. That was a great kind of commentary to conclude this on as well. And I appreciate your time. It's great to learn about FixUS and FixUS, and best of luck in continuing to grow that. It's already very impressive. And
thank you, Chris. And I would leave one last thought for this group. And one of my favorite quotes ever is from a guy named Ortega y Gasset. He was a South American writer, but he wrote, "Civilization is not just there. It is not self-supporting. If you want to make use of the advantages of civilization, but are not prepared to consume yourself with the upholding of civilization, you are done. Just a slip, and when you look around, everything has vanished into air." This is our moment, folks. There is no hero out there. We have to own this as citizens. So I would encourage you, if you are motivated, to please get involved. We need all the help we get. We have no monopoly on wisdom. We have no great ideologically certitude. We have humility and doubt, but we would love to build a national community of people willing to take back our country.
Excellent. Thank you,
Thanks
Paul.
very much, Chris.
Yep. Have a great one. We will, there's a number of questions that I didn't get to ask. I will try to share those with Rachel.
Would you forward those over, and we will absolutely answer all the questions that came in.
Yeah, certainly. So I appreciate the time. I'm going to share a couple concluding remarks, and then we'll be on our way. So,
Okay. All good.
All right. So just to the Economic Club members, I will share the recording so that those that weren't able to attend today can jump on. They can't hear me now, but it is what it is. I've noted the couple book recommendations that Paul made during the commentary. We'll try to include links for those as well. And our next meeting is scheduled for July 17th. So I expect that it'll be via this webinar format as well. So please plan on that. And I appreciate your time and attendance today. Tomorrow's the summer solstice, so enjoy your long sunny day today and tomorrow as well. Have a great weekend. Thanks again to Paul, and take care.